Well, welcome to everybody that's here and to all those that might be watching on the recording after. But on behalf of Short Answer and the Stanford Ed Club, we're super excited to have everybody here for tonight's webinar. My name's Adam Sparks. I'm the co-founder of Short Answer. So at Short Answer, we support writing across the curriculum initiatives to make it fun and easy to embed writing in any content area. And then we also lead workshops across the country focused on helping schools adjust writing instruction in the wake of AI. We're going to talk a lot about writing instruction today when it comes to assessment, because I think that's an area that's been maybe arguably hardest hit by the new AI tools in the world. And we're co-hosting tonight's event with the Stanford Ed Club. So Ed Club is a student-run organization it's a collaboration between the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Graduate School of Education that promotes discussions on pressing issues in education. So a huge thanks to Stanford Ed Club President Doug Phipps for all of his support in putting this event together. And of course, we're excited to be joined by Dr. Dylan Wiliam to discuss AI and the fundamental challenges and opportunities that it presents in K12 assessment and instruction. And I mean this when I say it, I can't think of a better person to speak on the topic. For those that don't know Dylan's work, he and Dr. Paul Black's 1998 article, Inside the Black Box, formed much of the foundation upon which modern K12 formative assessment is built. His writing, which includes embedded formative assessment, Creating the Schools Our Children Need, and his recent Making Room for Impact, amongst many others, have been used by schools across the world as foundational text for staff development training. Personally, Embedded Formative Assessment was the first professional development book I was ever assigned as a teacher. I still have my copy. It's here. I'm going to reference it tonight. It's dog-eared and has notes all over it. And it's fantastic, and it's crazy how relevant it continues to be, especially around some of these new questions that AI is presenting. But of all of Dylan's work, I think the piece arguably most relevant to our conversation tonight is a working paper that he recently co-authored with Drs. John Hattie and Aaron Hamilton called The Future of AI in Education, 13 Things We Can Do to Minimize the Damage. And I will share out in the follow-up email all of the things that I just referenced. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Dylan Wiliam. Dylan, how are you this evening?
Good, thanks. Yeah, good. Good to be here.
Okay, awesome. Well, I kind of want to lay out the structure to start. So we're going to start with kind of the how. So AI's influence on maybe changing or adjusting how we teach. I think I want to spend the bulk of our time there and spend the bulk of our time on formative assessment. I want to spend a little bit of time, though, on discussing potentially how AI changes what we teach. And then we'll go into audience QA. So that's kind of our broad structure. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So I want to start with the daily formative assessment practices, because to me, that's kind of where the core of the dilemma is. And the dilemma, as I see it, is, new AI tools can complete or help kids complete almost any task that we throw at them. And those tools are now in our students' pockets. So how do we adjust assessment to ensure that the evidence that we're collecting of student learning is valid and not necessarily completed by AI?
I think the key word in what you just said is valid. So we used to think about validity as a property of an assessment. An assessment was valid or it wasn't valid. And over the years, that definition has fallen into disuse because it just doesn't work. So if I give a math test to students and it has a high reading demand, then for students who are good readers, the variation in scores will reflect their math ability. But if I give it to a more mixed group of students, some good readers, some less fluent readers, then part of the variation in scores will be caused by their ability in math, but part of it will be caused by how good they are at reading. So the same test can support valid conclusions for some learners, but not for other learners. So now increasingly, the term validity is defined as a property of inferences, the conclusions we draw when we see students' outcomes. So when people say, is this a valid test? My immediate response is, well, you tell me what you propose to conclude on the basis of the results, and I'll tell you whether that's a reasonable conclusion. So the real problem is, it's difficult even to get started because different teachers have different goals for writing instruction. So the same assessment may support some conclusions and not others. So the question is, why are we teaching writing at all? And so, the starting point is why? What conclusions do we want to support? But I think most teachers really, certainly in daily writing instruction, really want to get evidence. They want to elicit evidence from their students so they can provide feedback to the students to improve their ability to write. And so what does the research on feedback say? Well, the problem is that the research on feedback is a mess because most of the research, first of all, most of the research is done at college level. So one review by Min Lee and Maria Ruiz Primo found that 75% of the published studies on feedback were done by college professors on their own students. You know, the joke is that psychology students are the most researched species on the planet. So whether we can generalize to K12 is a big problem. But I think the more salient issue is this. In 1996, two guys at Rutgers University, Kluger and Denisi, reviewed the research on feedback. And they tried to work out over 90 years, they went back to 1905 to 1995, looked at all the research on feedback. And they said, we're asking the wrong question. Because people were wanting to know, what is the effect size of feedback? And they said, well, what you should be focusing on is whether the effects of feedback are lasting and useful. So for example, feedback can improve student achievement, give you a big effect size by making the students dependent on the feedback.
Right.
And that will improve the quality of the work that students produce, but it doesn't allow them to write independently. And so the big challenge, I think, is that most of the research on feedback does not address the right question, which is, how does feedback make students less dependent on feedback?
Right.
That's
right.
the big issue.
Yeah.
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Adam.
So I think, I mean, what I hear you hitting on is the difference between performance and learning. And performance is kids, you know, how well they're doing on X task versus learning, which is like change in long-term memory or ability. And so, yeah, is the feedback that we're giving kids as a part of this, what is it improving, performance or learning? And so you've kind of already jumped into another question I wanted to ask you tonight, which is feedback, because one of the major promises of AI, I think right now in K12, especially on formative assessment, is that AI can speed up feedback cycles,
Yep.
especially on writing, which has always historically been a huge challenge. I guess, what are your perceptions on AI feedback in general, and I guess the promises and the perils of it?
Well, I've thought about this quite a lot in terms of how we frame this, particularly when I talk to teachers. And so your performance learning distinction, I think, is crucial, but I frame it like this. For me, the purpose of feedback is to improve the learner and not the work that they hand in. So it's a bit like a spell checker. A spell checker will improve the spelling of the work that you complete, but the spell checker doesn't teach you how to spell more effectively in the absence of the spell checker. And we've already seen, there's some quite nice studies already, that access to AI improves students' performance on tasks where they can use the AI, but degrades their performance when they're not allowed to use the AI. So the question is, what are we trying to improve? And the challenge, I think, really is that the feedback loops in education are very, very long. So, you know, we've seen advances in machine learning where they learn to play chess, where they learn to play Go and other games like that. And they work very well when they can iterate literally millions of games where they try strategies and refine and refine and refine. And they can do that because the feedback cycle is very short. The problem with education is the feedback loops are extremely long.
Right.
So there's a big debate around reading recovery, for example. So reading recovery is an intervention for struggling readers that was invented in New Zealand by Marie Clay. And there's been a big debate about it. But here's the real problem. Reading recovery uses techniques like triple queuing, you know, looking at the word, can you deduce the meaning of the word from the context, all those kinds of things. That kind of triple queuing is useful if you want to decipher this particular text.
Right.
But it doesn't teach you how to read other texts. And that's my problem with most of the AI feedback that I see. First of all, the loops in learning are years long.
Right.
So you can actually produce a short-term success using things like reading recovery, but you're actually damaging the student's learning for the long term.
Yeah.
And so my worry is that people are assuming that the feedback loops in education are very short, and they're not. They're literally years long, and therefore they're not very good at learning from context because they don't get enough iterations. So my problem, I think, really is that I'm very skeptical about the ability of AI to give feedback to students that will improve their long-term learning. It'll certainly help them improve the tasks that they're completing. But I think you need to have a theory of mind. You need to have a cognitive theory about what's happening inside a student's head to give meaningful feedback. And I
So,
don't think AI has that.
so I want to just play devil's advocate here,
Sure.
because we lead workshops across the country on AI and writing instruction, and so as a part of that, we will demo some AI feedback tools. And like this happened last week. I've literally had teachers get verklempt in the sessions, at the amount of time that it's going to save them in their daily work. The challenge of especially writing instruction, but really all instruction, is how long it takes to get kids feedback. And as a result, they get less feedback. You think about a typical writing assignment. Honestly, let's say you teach 125 kids and every assignment takes you 5 to 10 minutes to grade.
Yep.
You're looking at like 8 to 10 hours of grading. And so teachers are super excited about the potential to get kids more feedback faster, and save them and hopefully give them some free time back on Sunday so they can get back to their personal lives. So I guess that would be the kind of the AI optimist view of some of these new feedback tools. I'm curious your reaction to that.
I don't know how good that feedback is, but without that theory of mind, that cognitive theory, I don't see AI being able to give feedback that is improving the learner. It's going to be improving the work. So it's giving you comments on that piece of work. But what kind of process needs to take place with that feedback produced by the AI that will result in the student learning how to do better themselves in the future? That's the point. And so, yes, it can certainly save teachers a lot of time by giving them lower quality feedback than they would have got otherwise.
Right.
So, and I'm not saying it won't happen.
Right.
Because this stuff is improving at an incredible rate. But my big question is, how well does AI feedback help students produce better work in other domains other than the very specific area of that feedback on that task?
Right.
And
right. It's kind of going back to that learning versus performance kind of dynamic.
Well, it's not just that. It's you could have learning. So it might teach you how to write this particular kind of piece of writing much more effectively. But the point is that that's not the only kind of writing those students need to do. So right. I like to think that what gets better when you get better at writing is reasonably transferable to other places. Right. And I'm worried that the kind of feedback that AI gives might not be of that kind. Now, I'm also open to the idea that AI might be trainable. We could actually train AI to leave gaps in the feedback. So one of the ideas that I use in my workshops is this idea of making feedback into detective work. So rather than saying you haven't used enough specialist language in this response, you could say there are at least 5 places in these answers where it would be more effective to use more specialist language. I've highlighted 2 of them, scaffolding. Please redraft using the appropriate terms for the other 3. So I think good teachers have a way of giving feedback that invites the students in to respond and also leaves some of the thinking to the student.
Right.
And I haven't yet seen well-developed sort of user-friendly approaches to AI that leave enough of the thinking to the student for learning to take place. It seems to me to be much more focused on improving the product.
Right, right. So that goes back to your work in embedded formative assessment of the most important aspect of feedback is that it causes thinking. Yep. And I do often see that, just anecdotally when I use AI providing feedback on what I'm writing, it's either so specific and that it's literally telling me what to do. So all I have to do is copy paste it in and I don't have to think anymore. Or it's to your point that you wrote about in that book, it's accurate, but it's not helpful because it's telling me what I did wrong, but it's not really giving me a recipe for future action on what I need to do. Go ahead.
Sometimes, the goal is to actually improve the product. So if a class is working on a class newsletter, for example, then feedback that says there's a typo in column 1, line 3 is actually extremely helpful. Some of the time, the goal is to improve the product. But I would say that most of the time in school, it should be improving the learner.
Right. Yeah, and another issue I wanted to talk to you about, because it's something that I think about a lot. So for context, the short answer, the writing platform we're building, it is not an AI tool. We're a peer feedback tool, but we're tempted all the time to do some of these really cool features that we see other companies doing with AI feedback. But one thing I worry about is if if AI is the one providing the feedback and analyzing the student work and then kicking out a summary to the teacher of the students' work, who's making the decision in the classroom? Because when I think about the core of formative assessment, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the real core of it is like figuring out what your kids know and what they don't, and then adapting your instruction based on that.
Yeah,
And to what extent do you know about what your kids know and what they don't if you're not actually reading their work? Um,
right.
I'm curious how you think about that, because I also see the trade-off of like, well, the alternative is I don't read the students' work because I see 125 kids and I've got to grade. I don't have time to grade all this. So yeah, I don't know. I'm throwing a lot at you. What is your reaction to that?
That the teacher is the most expensive resource in the classroom.
Right.
So the question for me is, how do we make sure that the teacher's time in giving feedback is spent as productively as possible? So this may involve using AI tools to help the students shape the work. Now we're going to get into the issue about provenance and all those other kinds of things in a minute, I'm sure. But the idea that students should actually discuss how they used AI, how they took the feedback, which bits of AI feedback they rejected, for example.
Yeah.
And then that will be a good platform for a conversation with the teacher. So I think that we can't keep AI out of the classroom. I think it's foolish. I think we have to think about carefully about authentication. But for me, it's about making sure that those teacher conversations are as valuable as they can be. The other course issue is before you can give feedback, you have to get evidence. And before you can get evidence, you have to know what you're looking for.
Right.
So I think the real problem with writing instruction is the clarity of the vision that the teacher has about what good writing looks like, sharing that vision with the learner. So actually, I would like to get to a point where students say, I know this isn't very good. You see things like writing walls, where a student can do a self-assessment. My writing is like this. I can write like this. I can't write like this. So the idea is, if we do this job well, so let me just take a step back.
Yeah.
Effective summative assessment
Yeah.
requires teachers to share a construct of quality. I want all the teachers in a building having a clear shared vision of what good writing looks like. Effective formative assessment requires sharing that vision with the learner.
Right.
But then there's an extra step. Teachers need more than a sense of quality. They need an anatomy of quality. And this is what good sports coaches do. You know, they break things down into small steps and train those steps and build them back up again. So if we do our job well, the students will say, I'm not happy with this piece of work. It's not as good as it needs to be. I can see a piece of work that I really like, but I don't know how to get there. The challenge is, how can the teacher break that down to say to the student, what is the next small step?
Right.
That's the thing. I think that I haven't seen any evidence that AI can do that. I'm not saying it won't be able to do it maybe in a year or two, but right
Right.
now, AI will tell you how to get to the destination. It won't tell you how to get better at finding the destination yourself.
Right. There's a blogger that I really love. His name's Dan Meyer. He has a piece that touches on that. I wish I could remember the name, and we'll put it in the follow-up resources. At one point in which you were just describing, you talked about you said, and I think I'm quoting you on this. We're not going to be able to keep AI out of the classroom, and the most practical guidance that I have seen that comes from that perspective, I think, is this concept of an AI assessment scale. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. The person that I see kind of leading the way on this is a PhD student in Australia named Leon Furs,
Yep, yep.
and his AI assessment scale. But I also want to give a call out because we use this. His name's Adrian Cotterill. He's a educational. He's an administrator in Australia that has done a lot of work with their school. But essentially, it's thinking about assessment through the lens of a tiered layer of influence with AI. And at a simple, this is not Leon's work. This is just kind of a simplification of it. If I label this assignment red, the students cannot use any AI. If I label it yellow, they can use some with
Yep.
specific constraints. And if it's green, I want them to use AI. It's part of the learning goal of the activity. I'm curious what you think about these AI assessment scales.
I think they're very useful as a way of describing what we see in classrooms. I'm just not sure of their pedagogical or educational value. So
Mm,
for me, let's have this scale. Let's have color coding. Let's have red, yellow, green for AI usage. But what interests me is the process by which the teacher decides which kind of activity this is. It's got to be driven by a theory of learning
right,
for that to make any sense. So
right,
the question is preventing the use of AI in this particular task going to promote or hinder the learning? That is the question we should be asking. So yes, there will be times when we want to see what students can do without the AI, and sometimes the AI can be supportive, but that should be driven by a goal. My goal is to get the students to here are the activities that I'm going to engage them in to get them to make that progress.
right,
And here is the way I'm going to restrict or channel the use of AI to make the intended learning more likely.
right. Yeah, and so I think along those same lines, because this is a question I get a lot from teachers, because we do promote that red, yellow, green label system because of its simplicity,
Yeah.
but also because just the practical nature of kind of accepting that AI is now in the hands of our kids, whether we like it or not. But a question I get a lot is, well, should we weight our grades that are going in the grade book based on like, I don't know, like we'll just make up numbers like 90% of the assignments going into the grade book should be red labeled and 5% should be yellow and the other 5% should be green or something. I'm curious how you might think about that, or just this broader question of, in the age of AI, what should go in the grade book?
The answer to that is, what's the point of the grade book? The
Hey,
real problem, the real problem is that we've got this really weird system, and I can just about defend it in high school. I can't defend it in middle school or elementary school because the purpose is to motivate students. Okay, so students are working for a grade, but we know that that's problematic. But here's my issue with grade books. The question I always ask with teachers is, do you use your grade book to plan instruction? And no teacher I've ever met says yes.
right,
The grade book is a way of recording a series of measures of some kind of contribution or work that a student has done, but has zero pedagogical value to the teacher in terms of planning future instruction. So what I would like to see is a grade book that actually tells the teacher the strengths and weaknesses of each student in the class, so they can actually use that. Would you use the grade book for creating homogeneous groups in the classroom? Would you use the grade book for producing heterogeneous groups?
right.
So I'm going to look at these students actually have these complementary strengths. I'm going to put them in a group together. That to me seems a grade book worth having. The grade books we have currently have zero pedagogical value apart from the presumed and I think suspect benefit of motivating students. Students do it because there's a grade. So I think for me, I think the real problem is that we can have a conversation of what should go in the grade book, but I think the answer is not grades.
Okay. Well, that is a huge system levels change here in the United States
Exactly.
to get rid of grades. So,
Well,
so
I don't know. So I'm not saying get rid of grades. I'm saying get rid of. I'm saying let's give students grades at the end of sequences of learning. So maybe once every quarter in high school, maybe once every semester in middle school, maybe once every year in elementary school. So at the end, so yeah, parents will get a grade that is achievement based at the end of some period of learning. What I'm interested in is what goes into that grade and what information the teacher collects and records about the student between the grades.
right.
So I'm aware that the American system probably depends on grades to work right now, and I don't think we're going to change that. What we can do is have grades that do the thing that grades are meant to do, which is to provide evidence of student achievement. And I don't think our grades do that currently.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so tell me if I'm not, um, that sounds like a transition to a place where maybe the overwhelming majority, if not 100% of a kid's grade is summative assessment. Am I mishearing you on that, or is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I think there's a step we need to take to get to that point. What I would say is that the data that the teacher collects routinely is driven by a formative purpose,
Right.
and then the same data is basically reinterpreted for summative purposes at certain periods. So let me give you a simple example. You're recording a student's understanding of the gas laws in middle school science. Okay, so I've seen this girl demonstrate this understanding on one occasion. She didn't do it on another occasion. I'm going to say she hasn't got it yet.
Right.
Because I want that record to function formatively. Now, if I'm going to summarize at the end of the semester, because I've seen it once, I might give her the benefit of the doubt. So what I'm saying is that summative and formative purposes drive different ways of interpreting the same data.
Right.
What I'm saying is, the fundamental principle is this: you can always aggregate fine scale data for a formative purpose to produce a summative report. You can't reverse engineer a grade to determine learning needs. So for me, I think the record keeping system should be driven by the teacher's day-to-day practice, periodically aggregated for reporting purposes, rather than being from the outset a summative device.
Right. Right. Okay. I had my nice little neat list of 10 questions I was going to ask you, and now
no idea where we are.
yeah, I've got no idea where we are. There was one question that I wanted to ask that was related to this gradebook question.
Okay.
Because I've heard this suggested, and I would just love to get your thoughts on it. Is homework dead? Meaning like the concept of, all right, we just did our exit ticket, but for homework, you need to complete these 10 questions and come in the next day and turn it in. And I'm going to maybe grade that and put in the grade book, or even just use that for whatever, like bell ringer or something next day. Is homework dead? Is the traditional way we think about homework dead?
That kind of homework is dead, but homework is not.
Okay, tell me more.
So let me give you an example of a thing that I do with my master's level students. I assign a chapter for them to read. The differences between Piaget and Vygotsky in their view of learning. They know that when they come to the next session, there'll be a multiple choice question with 4 options about the differences between Piaget and Vygotsky. I'm going to ask them to use finger voting, 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, 4 for D, to see if they've actually understood the chapter. And there's a couple of really sneaky questions because there's an obvious misconception that teachers have about the difference between Piaget and Vygotsky. But the really important point is I'm judging what's in their heads, not what is being produced in writing. So I think homework as that kind of go home and read this chapter, and then there'll be a quick quiz, not written down, but just finger voting, with me asking you to explain why you chose A, why you chose B. And it'll be very obvious very quickly which students have done the reading homework and which students have done the learning that's intended. Right. So I think as long as we focus on what's in their students' heads rather than what's in the documents they produce, then I think homework has a valuable role to play. If you want to set homework, I think the debate on homework is still very much up in the air. The benefits of homework are quite difficult to demonstrate. And, most of it is this, you better get used to it later on sort of thing. But the fact is that most college students don't work as hard as most high school students these days. So, I don't think that's a very strong argument these days.
So what I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're saying we need to do more assessment under controlled conditions. The controlled condition in what you just said being, you did the reading outside of class, but I'm going to assess your understanding of it in class, where I can monitor the influence of outside sources.
Yeah. I think control conditions is important. So, I'm quite relaxed about having, timed writing exercises, maybe with support, some sort of open book things as well, if people want. So it's just a simple question. What conclusions can you draw about that student by seeing what they produce? And if they've had unfettered access to AI, the answer is not very much.
Right.
So for me, control conditions are not a way of denying students resources. They're a way of strengthening the conclusions we can draw about that student, and in particular, what kinds of help they need.
Right.
So if kids cheat with AI, it's a bit like getting somebody else to take your blood test for you. You might actually get a better result on the blood test, but it's not going to help the doctor figure out what you need, what kind of treatment or medications you need.
Right. And I totally agree with that. the pushback that I would get if I, was presenting to a room full of educators is, well, what if I teach writing? And I know I put this to you on Twitter recently, and you said we
Yeah.
are all writing teachers, and I agree with you as someone who is building a cross-curricular writing tool. But if I'm an 11th grade English teacher and I got to do my, we're doing like a whatever 15-page, kind of hardcore research paper for a high school kid, that necessarily needs to take place over time. So
Yep.
I'm not going to be able to do all that in the class. So what about that scenario?
So I think that we just need to go back to this fundamental question. How do you know what is the student's work? So one of the things you can do is build in ways of tracking provenance. What are the drafts? Change the assignment maybe. Which bits of AI advice did you reject and why? So I think there's all kinds of ways of developing that student's critical ability to use AI thoughtfully so that we are still ending up with something that's of educational value, but it just needs to have, it'll be different in different subjects. And I think that's, writing is also a very diverse field, writing as response to text, to what extent does Shakespeare present Lady Macbeth as a powerful woman? Writing for 45 minutes on that, I think would be a very good test of students. And I'd be very happy to sort of wander up and down the aisles, looking at students' work and then drawing out issues. Here's the interesting thing, by the way. There's an assumption in US writing instruction that the feedback needs to be individual. So the writing is a very personal thing, and therefore I should be feeding back to this individual student about their particular writing. One of the things I see in Japanese teaching is the teacher will be walking up and down the aisles when the students are doing writing, but they will then be storing up in their minds the things they want to have a whole class discussion about.
Right.
And so I think that we've, in many ways, individualized too much in writing instruction, because there are some principles of writing that I think can be shared more widely, that I think that, so that the teacher should be monitoring for things they can have a whole class discussion about.
Right.
And I think that is, a particular way that AI could be helpful. And then asking, give me a suggestion that AI gave that you thought was stupid or not very smart, that you rejected.
Right.
Just basically surfacing. So basically not hiding the AI, but surfacing it, and then seeing what kinds of conversations we can have with our students.
Right. And in the context of writing, at one point you touched on this, but what I hear the most, and I agree with it, is focusing more on process than product, and getting kids to critically reflect on their process, even if they do use AI to help them, and embed that, reflections on process as a part of the assessment construct. So with that, I just had this brilliant question and now I can't remember it.
Okay, well, let me
yeah, go ahead.
riff on about that before. So yes, writing as a process, but the point is, not any process will do. So I think often we say process rather than product. Yeah. But the question is, what kind of processes are useful? And I think we often don't have those conversations. That's the issue for me, is what is what processes are you servicing? What kinds of conversations are you having around those processes with your students? And again, having more, one of the I remember a workshop that Stephen Ball, a very prolific sociologist of education, did when I was at King's College in London. And he produced an early draft of one of his articles. And he just let us just tear through it and just looking at all the things that needed to be improved. And so just having those conversations at a group level.
Yeah.
To say, what makes good writing? Why is that impactful? Why is that way of phrasing it more impactful? Why is that way less clear? Those kinds of conversations at a group level, I think, are far more likely to be generalizable to other kinds of writing. I think the other thing, this is a point that Robert Pondisio has made, often writing instruction in the US is looking inward. It's about students writing about their own personal experiences. And I want to see more looking outwards.
Interesting.
Just arguing, making cases, informational writing, assembling an argument. And that's where it links beautifully with things like science and Toulmin's structure of argument model. That's the way I think to make those kinds of links. And then I think it's also one that AI can help with.
Right. And while you were describing that, I remembered my question.
So you would.
So when we talk about process over product, that kind of takes us, at least in my mind, to metacognition and self-regulated learning and getting kids to,
Mhm.
and that's something I worry about a lot. The concern being with AI, that it can very easily become an easy button
Yeah.
for thinking and for short-circuiting thinking. Um, and I can see a scenario where a kid is using AI to help them learn, and they think that it's helping them learn because it might be improving their performance on a task or improving, their confidence or whatever. Um, but um, but it's actually they're just outsourcing their thought to the AI. The AI is thinking for them, and
Yep.
it's sort of tricking them into an illusion of competence. Where if we took away that scaffold, maybe they would perform very differently. But our kids don't necessarily have, at a K-12 level, the metacognitive or self-regulated learning skills to recognize that. And that's always been a key part of your work, which is one of the 5 pillars of effective formative assessment, as you lay out, is getting kids to be owners of their own learning and developing that metacognition and self-regulated learning skills. So how do you think about best practice with that in general, and especially in the context of AI, where I think it's doubly important?
I think it comes back to some very basic principles, the sorts of thing that Daniel Willingham has laid out, which is what feels right often isn't right in learning. So students are actually very bad judges of their own learning. There's lots of studies that show that student evaluations of teaching are negatively correlated with learning. Students like teachers who make things easy for them. So it's not surprising that students like the easy button. Henry Ford once said, "We know that thinking is difficult because of the length people go to avoid doing it." So kids want to produce the best work for the least effort, but we have to explain to them why that is not a way of getting smarter. You don't get smarter by pressing the easy button. You get smarter by engaging in more challenging tasks. And there's lots of parallels you can draw, asking very young kids, if you want to increase your strength, what's going to make you stronger? Lifting easy weights or lifting heavy weights? Kids get that. There's a quite nice intersection with the work on growth mindset. So in one of the studies that David Yeager and his colleagues did, they looked at growth mindset interventions. But for the control group, they asked the students to make a worksheet. And the students had to come up with 10 problems. And there were some that were easy that you'd get right, but you wouldn't learn anything. And there were some that were much more challenging. And they were told they were more challenging, but it would probably teach you something. And the clever thing was that they actually used the number of difficult questions that the students included in their worksheets as an index of challenge seeking in that classroom. So I think that, for me, surfacing these aspects of metacognition. Do you like easy work or do you like hard work? Why do you like easy work? And just having those conversations. Yes, you're going to get a high score, but it's not going to make you smarter. I think all those kinds of conversations need to take place. The other thing we need to say to students is, what feels as if it's helping you learn doesn't work. There's now quite a lot of research that shows that students consistently express processes to review. They express preferences for review processes that are actually less successful, like rereading and highlighting, when we actually know that retrieval practice and practice testing are far more effective.
Right.
And I would go further than this. None of us know when we're learning. I've lost track of the number of times I've put things in my freezer and I haven't bothered to label it because I know I'm going to remember what it is. And 6 weeks later, I take out this frozen mass and I have no idea what it is. Now, the fact that I forgot is not important. What is important is how certain I was that I would remember.
Right. Right.
So I think the whole metacognitive process is partly about getting students to understand that your insight, your judgment of learning is actually highly likely to be wrong.
Right.
And therefore, you need to think very carefully about what actually works versus what doesn't. I would actually do experiments. With high schoolers, I would get them to review one chapter by review and by highlighting, and review another chapter by practice testing and retrieval practice, and then let them see which ones they do better on in the test. So I'd want to demonstrate. So I want to surface metacognition as something that we have to teach our students because it's not intuitive.
Right. Let them experience it. Don't just tell them it's important. Right.
Yeah, and so this is basically that Robert Bjork has said this, that students consistently blame factors that are outside their control, like the work being too hard or not being smart enough, and consistently underrate the importance of study practices.
Right.
And so just getting that conversation going, I think, yes, the AI will help you produce a better piece of work, but it won't make you smarter.
Right. Well, on behalf of the Stanford Ed Club, I have to give a shout out because you're citing Stanford researchers left and right. We've got Harold Dweck's growth mindset research. Earlier, you referenced Maria Ruiz Primo, who's a formative assessment researcher here. So shout out to Stanford Ed Club for sponsoring and hosting this event.
Well, that's probably not a coincidence because I had a research project at Stanford jointly. Paul Black and I worked with Rich Shavelson, Mike Atkin, and others on formative assessment in some classrooms in California, actually. So that was great fun. So that's probably the reason I'm so familiar with that work.
Amazing. Yeah, I have to give Stanford a shout out. And I'm also realizing to our participants that are here, I apologize. I disabled the chat and I disabled the QA before we got into this. So I'm sitting here asking you to ask questions and I'm like, why are there no questions? And I'm getting texts from my wife that are like, you disabled the chat. So what we're going to have to do is here in about 10 minutes here, you'll have to raise your hand and then we'll actually pull you onto the stage for you to ask your questions. So you're gonna have to be brave and we'll pull you on to chat. So I apologize for the technical issues. Within that, though, I want to ask you a couple more questions. So you mentioned like talking about issues of motivation and like challenging kids and getting them to reflect on challenging things. And I think about that a lot because, and you talk about this, you and John Hattie and Aaron Hamilton talk about this in your paper on AI, which is like, why are kids going to want to learn anything in a world where machines can do almost any task that we throw at them? And that's especially true of writing right now because large language models are good at stringing together words into writing. But I'm just curious in general, as AI improves, how do you think about that motivation issue of motivation has always been a challenge, especially at the high school level in K12. But now we live in a world where AI can do anything for our kids. So yeah, how do we motivate kids to learn anything in this world?
How do we motivate kids to learn skateboarding?
I don't know. I've never skateboarded.
You don't need to. The point is that for some kids, it's what they want to do. So I think that you're absolutely right. I think the thing that's crazy about AI is that it's automating the tasks that we have consistently placed a higher value on. So the work of lawyers, the work of accountants, the work of even doctors, certainly in terms of diagnostic medicine, is becoming routine. And so those tasks are being automated more quickly than the kind of more manual kind of tasks that we used to look down on, and to a certain extent still do. So it depends how things play out. But when I first started teaching in the 1970s, I taught in a school with quite low levels of achievement. And there's an examination system in the UK, England at the time, that was intended for the top 60% of achievers. And the bottom 40%, they weren't expected to get any qualifications at all. So I had this group of 9th and 10th graders who weren't going to be bribable. We weren't be able to bribe them. You've got to do this because it's going to be on the exam. So we developed a math curriculum that was based on the kinds of math that those students might be interested in. So we had math of bricklaying, math of plumbing, of electrical work. And so those kids could see themselves going into those kinds of jobs. And that was motivating for them because they could see the relevance of it. But that was still vocational. What I'm saying is that if AI does replace most human work, then we need to go back to the Greek ideal. The idea that having to work for a living is undignified. Right now, we regard work as dignifying, as what gives people meaning. What would an education system look like if it was designed to produce people of leisure?
Right.
And so, I hope there'll be, amateur dramatics. I hope there'd be drama and music. AI can compose music, but how could AI? I'm not sure that AI is ever going to be able to improvise in a jazz band where the musicians are listening to each other about what to do next. So that kind of connection, I think, is uniquely human. And so I think training our pupils for a life like that,
yeah,
I think could be a goal, but it means completely uprooting everything that we're doing right now. And it's much more like the kind of the unschooling movement of Illich and places like Summerhill in England, where students choose what to do. And the fact is that most of them manage to find things to do because there's interesting things out there, but intrinsic motivation would take over. So I think that could be a much more productive future where we're not training pupils for work, students for work, but who knows how quickly that will come around. You know, maybe within 30 years it'll be here. In the meantime, what we need to be doing is educating students for a world where they're going to have to carry on learning, because the skills that we can teach them won't be relevant by the time they get into the workplace. And that's the point that Seymour Papert makes. And he studied under Jean Piaget, whose definition of intelligence was knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. I think that's the real problem with the assessment-oriented culture in the United States, is that we are very good at getting our students to do the things that they've seen before. But how smartly can they react to the things they've never seen before? And that, I think, is something we need to inculcate in our students. And I want a curriculum with literature, with great books, reading them, not because it's going to be on the exam, but because it's part of becoming a more fully human person.
Right. Yeah, and you've already kind of touched on, after that motivation question, I'm like, to what extent do we begin to adjust what we teach in addition to how we teach? And it might be too early, because before folks jumped on the call, you and I were talking about, nobody has a map on where this is going.
Right.
At best, we have a compass, and the compass is research-based best practice, but even that can be tricky with how novel some of this new technology is. So that whole, how do we adjust what we teach in addition to how we teach, is sometimes feels impossible, but you've kind of touched on it there. We have about 13 minutes left in our call, and I want to give the audience some chance to ask questions. But before that, Dylan, do you have any?
I have one.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was in your list of questions, which we barely made a dent in, was can we detect AI usage?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I'm pretty sure no.
Yeah, I agree.
So I asked Claude AI to produce a school assessment policy for a middle school, did a very nice job. I fed it into an AI detector. It said there was a 74% chance it was produced by AI. I deleted the first sentence, fed it through again, 4% chance it was AI produced. So basically, get your chat GPT output, feed it into a translator into French, feed it back into English, then put it through a paraphraser. AI is not going to be able to detect it. And right now there's a package called Stealth GPT that will reduce the possibility of AI detecting, AI detection engines spotting it as AI produced to 0%. So we're not going to be able to detect AI usage. We better adjust to that reality.
I could not agree more. And it's funny you brought that up. I had a guest blog post with Matt Miller, who's a very influential ed tech thinker in the United States this week, where we walked through the research, and it explains what you just described. There was a study out of the University of Maryland Computer Science Department that found when simple paraphrasing of ChatGPT outputs drops the efficacy of these detection tools by 90%. And there's another study, and I'll link this in the follow-up to everybody, out of the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, the conclusion of their study is these tools should not be used in educational settings because they're not reliable enough. So yeah, unfortunately, AI detection is not the easy button that we would hope it might be. Okay, I've got hands up, and I want to respect that with the 10 minutes that we have left. I'm just going to go in the order that I see them. So Lee is first. Lee, I'm going to click allow you to talk, and hopefully we can hear what you have to say. So go ahead, Lee. Oh, perfect, and you're here. Awesome. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Lee, if you're there. See if Lee is still present with us. All right, I don't think Lee is there, so I'm going to lower his hand, and we are going to do this. And next up, I see Paula. So Paula, I'm going to have you ask your question. Go ahead, Paula, if you're there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Great. I must say that I completely agree that with most of what you said about how AI can be useful for learning. It will depend on the human deciding how to use it. And beyond this idea that AI could bring more or speed the formative feedback process, do you see other areas where AI could have a positive impact on the learning?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because that was one of mine that I wanted to get to, of not just dwelling on the negative. Yeah, what are the opportunities, do you think, Dylan? Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, hi, Paula. Uh, I think that we can certainly think of ways in which AI can be structured to produce um, better guidance for students. So there's a quite nice study by Bastani et al. Came out. Does ChatGPT make things worse? Yes, if the usage is unconstrained. What they managed to do was to constrain the usage of ChatGPT and it actually enhance learning. So, for example, you might be designing, teaching students to do step-by-step algebra, for example. What you then do is to actually limit the number of times that they could ask for help or ask for a nudge or a suggestion. And then the ChatGPT would record the amount of help it had given, and that would be taken into account in the final assessment. So that students would have an incentive not to ask for help unless they needed it. So I think in all those kinds of ways, I think ChatGPT can be quite an intelligent tutor. It's also very good at making revision guides. So, you can take passages of text, a chapter, for example, and ask it to make up some flashcards. So I think there's a whole range of ways in which students can use AI tools to study more effectively, provided they know what it is that they should be doing with that technology. Practice testing rather than review.
Awesome. Thank you. Again, thanks for the question. I appreciate all the folks with hands up. We're going to go to Michael Chertson next. Mike, I know Michael. He's a Stanford student. I'm excited to have him. So, Michael, go ahead if you're there.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Welcome.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for having me. Dr. Williams, thank you for so many fantastic thoughts. My notes are very full. One thing I had written down very early that I wanted to hear you talk about, and you all came to it, is like, how do we teach kids sort of how to close that loop when we were talking about short-term versus long-term feedback, of like, how do we teach kids how to close that loop sort of for themselves using AI? And you all kind of got to that when talking about sort of like the metacognition piece. One thing I'm still curious about that came up in that conversation, though, you talked about like student motivations and like students want, like how students think of teaching and like easy work and what they value. And I just wanted to sort of complicate that a little bit, and I'd be curious what you think about my complication. I would say that students don't necessarily want work to be easy, they want to ensure future safety. And so high school students think about wanting work that guarantees high marks, not because they want high marks, it's because they know high marks are how our society has set up them having success and opportunities later. So I would argue the way we really need to rethink about that grading and AI and how all of those sort of play together is restructure the incentive system, not necessarily internal human like motivation behaviors. What do you think about that?
Look, if we can do that, that'd be great. I do see students not opting to choose elective courses that will give them an A- rather than an A. We see students making safe choices all the time, and I think it's disastrous for learning. So if we can actually change the system, then that's great. My concern most of the time, I mean, I'm often asked for policy advice, but all the times I've tried to get involved in policy have come to nothing because the policymakers change too quickly. So that's why I try to work with teachers, because they're still going to be around in 10 years' time. The policymakers will have moved on to something else. So if we can change those policies, that's absolutely great. But my worry is that what do we do in the meantime?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Michael. Next, we're going to go to Bror. Bror, I'm gonna pull you on here. So if you're there, get ready to ask your question. And I apologize for the nature of this. I wish we had a chat going, but let me go allow talk for Bror. Welcome, Bror.
Unmute. Did I unmute successfully? Did this work?
Yes.
Oh, yes, good. Dylan, nice to see you. Bror Saxberg here. One thing that I think is really intriguing and might be worth a minute more is this issue of, well, what are the skills that students need to become able to decide and do? It's a little bit, we're not really thinking students need to compete with calculators and spreadsheets in multiplying 3-digit numbers anymore. That was an important 19th century skill, but now it's like, no. And yet there are analytic insights, understanding limitations that are, that you want students to become aware of. So I think on the one hand, that very question of, wait a minute, what actually are the important things that students need to decide and do, when the workplace is going to have AI everywhere. That's one piece.
Mhm.
Second piece that's worth talking about is what are skills that are going to last an entire human life? And I think one whole category of those is these sort of editorial, curatorial skills to oversee work from other agents. But then there's another basket of these things, which is brain-to-brain skills. And so when you think of writing for purpose of persuasion, rhetoric, and so forth, the brains on both sides are going to stay the same for the next 500 years. And so now how you communicate may very well change, but getting clarity on what are real skills that students will be able to use for their entire lives, and then start that practice as early as possible, may be something that we should be doing instead of the kind of product-based standards that right now seem to dominate a lot of our thinking about what should students, decide and do.
I think you're right. I think it's a long-term venture. I think we've actually gone off on completely the wrong foot with things like 21st century skills, because we try to conceptualize things like critical thinking in a content independent way. And it just basically, it becomes trivial. So to think critically, you have to think critically about something you need domain knowledge. But I do have a suspicion there are some things that could be quite generic. I'm just not sure what they are yet, but I think it's definitely worthwhile trying to figure out what those should be, and then see what kind of activities would develop those kinds of dispositions. So, I can think of things like growth mindset. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a good thing to have in the future, that you realize that being given tasks that are easy to complete aren't going to make you smarter. That seems to me to be a very powerful asset for an individual to have in facing an uncertain future. But yes, I think that we need a redesign of the curriculum backwards from what are those dispositions? And it goes back to Ralph Tyler back in 1949. What do we want in school leavers? What activities should we organize to get them there? And how can we figure out if we've been successful? Those are the same three questions we should be asking for any education system. And we've known the questions for a long time. We just haven't got very many good answers.
Well, we've got 2 minutes left, and I want to respect Dylan's time and stay within our time limit. So I just want to say, first of all, I apologize to everyone that's got their hands up, because we've got a ton of folks that have questions, and I want to continue this dialogue. So what I would encourage you to do is follow up with us. So we'll send a recording of this along with all the resources that we mentioned in this chat. But then along with that, we plan to do more webinars on this topic. So if you're interested in this and we want to keep the conversation going, keep an eye out for it in the email list. But Dylan, I just want to thank you for your time tonight. This was a really valuable conversation. And it's one that, again, I think we need to continue on with, because it is such a huge, challenging topic. And I love that at the end here, we're getting to literally existential questions of like, this requires systems level change and thinking through not just how we teach, but what we teach. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And we'll see you all again soon.